But something happened along the way. The two sides had a whole range of issues that they had to solve if you were going to separate the country. Where was the border? What kind of military demilitarization? What do you do about armed forces across the border? What do you do about the oil sector? If the oil's in one place and the export facilities are the other, what are all the relationships, et cetera? And I had a group at the U.S. Institute of Peace working for the State Department that gave me a list of at least 9 issues they said must be solved by July 9th, 2011, when the South becomes independent. And July 9th, 2011 came along, and not one of the issues had been resolved. And why did that happen? A very curious diplomatic situation. What happened was that each side felt that they were going to be in a stronger position after July 9th than before. So they only went through the motions before. We had meeting after meeting after meeting. I used to joke that the only thing those meetings agreed upon was a motion to adjourn. And it usually came in the first hour. Nobody wanted to deal with it, and here's why. Here's what Sudan said to us. You guys in the West are going to be very sorry. You think you've championed these people, you've said they have rights, they've been oppressed, you wanted them to be independent, you just wait. They won't be able to govern that country. They're not capable of governing that country. They have so many ethnic divisions and differences, the country will become unstable, you'll be sorry, and they'll be on their knees to us, coming back to us after a while. What did the South Sudanese say? Wait till we're independent. We'll own the oil. That's a different story. Second, we'll have all the status of statehood. We'll have all the international legal support. We will be in the driving position on the negotiations. Now, you look at it from a negotiating point of view, this is a prescription for deadlock. And that's what occurred. And so what we've had since 2011 is a very fragile peace between these two countries, and very fragile. Border clashes, fights over the oil sector, arguments over payments, support by each country of rebels in the other, and that producing crisis after crisis after crisis. And this has preoccupied, if you will, the international community, all of us, for the last 2 years, because the worst thing you could see was to have the two countries go back to war. Now, I mentioned oil. Oil has become, of course, vital to South Sudan. It supplies 98% of South Sudan's budget. But South proceeded in the negotiations with an idea that oil was so important to the North to have an oil agreement, have the exports go through, get some money from that, that in the end of all the negotiations, of all the issues, there'd be a grand bargain. And in that grand bargain, one of the most contentious issues, a disputed area called Abyei, which was badly disputed, should be in the North, should be in the South. The strategy of the South was, when we get to that point, we will trade oil for Abyei, and we'll get Abyei. Now, we didn't think that was going to work. We did not agree that the reason the North was holding on to Abyei had to do only with extracting oil payments from the South. Nevertheless, it meant that the South held back for a long time on the oil agreement. And that became so contentious that in 2012, South Sudan cut off its own oil production, shut it down. Said, we're not going to put up with all the obstacles. We fought in the bush for 20 years, we can go back, etc. Well, you couldn't go back, you're a government. And by the end of 2012, South Sudan, in my view, was very close to total bankruptcy. And the question was, how do you resolve this problem? Now, one of the things that I found in negotiating issues like this is what seems to be the issue is not necessarily the issue. You have to find out what the real issue is. And the real issue in the oil sector was this. Sudan expected and felt somehow it was agreed that they would get compensation for giving up 70% of the oil. It wasn't just that they would have fees paid to them to pump the oil through their pipeline and all the rest. There would be a cash payment, a compensation payment. How much? Well, you have to figure out how much it would be. South Sudan said, we're the ones who were devastated by the war. We have less infrastructure than they did. We're poorer than they are. And we have to pay them now compensation. Without that, there could be no oil agreement. And to convince South Sudan to make that commitment was not easy. And it came down to, as I would say to my friends in South Sudan, it may not be fair, but it is the price of peace. And in the end, there was an agreement struck in August last year, which will, over 3 years, pay Sudan an extra $3 billion in compensation for losing the oil. That was one piece of the negotiations that held things up. But there were other issues, and the issue that continued to upend all our efforts between the two was the support on each side of rebels in the other country. Now what happened just as South Sudan was, sometimes I think Sudan is cursed, but what happened just as South Sudan was becoming independent, another rebellion broke out in Sudan. Along this area here, 2 states right on the border, Southern Kordofan and Blue Nile, they're called the 2 areas. And these were people who had fought with the South during the Civil War. In fact, some of the best fighters came from there. But they were left in Sudan. The border was below them. So they had all these grievances of their own, and the idea was there would be a process of political consultation, and Khartoum would listen to them, etc. That hadn't happened. And war broke out in those 2 provinces. From Sudan's point of view, the problem with that rebellion was that the South was feeding arms and support to those rebels. And if the South wouldn't do that, they could handle it. They could crush them, they could, buy them off, whatever. That's the traditional Sudan way. And for the South, even though the South officially denies ever giving that aid, but of course they were, it was a very difficult situation. These were their former comrades in arms. These were people who fought with them. These were people who were now being bombed and being denied access to food, etc. How could they simply stand by and not help them? But by helping them, they were jeopardizing all their agreements with Sudan, because Sudan was prepared to go back on the oil agreement, go back on anything, as long as that went on. And that continues today, although somewhat modified, as one of the basic problems between the 2 countries. Now, I want to come back to that, because I think now, as we look ahead, the real problem is not the border issues and not the issues between Sudan and South Sudan. The real issues in the future are the internal politics of Sudan and South Sudan. But I want to come back to that. Because while this is going on, other issues, of course, were also. The border issue is a very, very difficult one. You'd think that there would be a common border between Sudan, but everybody said, well, we use the British. The British were colonial power in all of Sudan, but they administered the North and the South differently. So we'll use the British maps. Well, turns out the British don't have one map. They have lots of maps. And pieces of it kept changing from one part to the other. So there was supposed to be a 1956 line, and when you looked, it wasn't clear what the 1956 line was. But more important, people on different sides of the line were ethnically related, and resources mattered. So where you drew the line, even if that was the right line, people in the South said, no, that's our traditional home. You can't give that away. So there are at least 5 areas along the border that are officially disputed. And part of the problem is to figure out how you mediate that. In all of this, you have 2 armies up against each other along the border. And so in all these crises over the last 2 years, you have clashes, you've had bombing, you've had armies crossing from one section to another. And this has been the preoccupation of much of the international community. Now let me talk a little about the U.S. role. I said that in the negotiations leading up to 2005, peace process, there was a troika, US, Norway, Britain. And together, we played a very important supportive role to the negotiations going on that led to that peace agreement. But then something happened for the United States, and actually for our Western partners as well, and that was Darfur. Because out of the terrible crisis in Darfur, the International Criminal Court indicted the president of Sudan and two of his other senior officials, including the current Minister of Defense, for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Now, in US policy, even though we're not members of the court, the Darfur crisis was referred by the Security Council to the ICC, and we are members of the Genocide Convention. So it's US practice not to have any dealings with people who have been indicted by the ICC and are not cooperating. Now, wait a minute, what does that do to your diplomacy? In the early diplomacy, when there was a problem, President Bush could call up and call President Bashir on the phone, or Danforth could go see him. I couldn't, and none of my later predecessors could ever talk to President Bashir. That doesn't mean we're not relevant to the negotiations, but we're not in the same place. I never quarreled with that policy. All I said was, you have to recognize what that means. We have two policies running at the same time. One is we want peace between these two countries, which means they all come together, they solve their problems, they become they prosper, etc. But the other is we want the head of state to go to The Hague and be prosecuted for genocide, and we won't deal with your country at that level until it happens. And those aren't entirely compatible policies. They bumped up against each other all the time. But the more important thing from my point of view was we can no longer take a leading role in the negotiations. And the reason is, and sometimes people would get frustrated, the African Union is now in the lead of negotiations and led by a former South African president and a very brilliant man. But sometimes people at the White House would get frustrated and they'd say, he's not doing a good job, why don't we take it over? And I would say, you can't take it over if we don't speak to the president of one of the two contending parties. So we have had to adopt a different form of diplomacy. One, of course, is to support the African Union, to rely on others to relay the concerns to President Bashir, but also to continue, even though the Sudan government doesn't like us very well, to continue to persuade them that we are still very relevant to their concerns and their ultimate peace and prosperity. Now, how do you do that? How do you become relevant when they really don't like you? They have all these sanctions, and etc. First of all, because they can never ultimately come out of their international isolation until they've regularized relations with the United States. Our sanctions are such that Sudan cannot access the international financial community, which means you can't even use a credit card in Sudan. So they are very restricted, and trade is restricted, and investments are restricted, etc. But second, we're important in the negotiations, whether we're talking to President Bashir or not, because we are very much involved with all the other parties. And particularly, we have influence with South Sudan, because we have good relations there, a major aid program, etc. But third, more than any other country, we are in touch with those rebels that they're now facing in southern Kordofan and Blue Nile, and now a resurgence of rebel activity in Darfur. Nobody else has stayed in touch with them as we have. The Europeans are too shy to do it because these people are fighting to overthrow a government. You shouldn't talk to them that much. We talk to them a lot. But not because we think they can or should focus on overthrowing the government, because frankly, they cannot militarily overthrow this government. But what we have been doing with them is saying, wait a minute, at some point, if there's going to be a political settlement of this conflict, what are you going to say when you go into the negotiation? What's your political platform? Yeah, you say you want to overthrow the government, but supposing you're in negotiation, what's your vision of the United Sudan? So we have spent a lot of time with them to help them develop a political platform that would appeal to all Sudanese, not just their people on the so-called periphery. Now, the people in Sudan don't like it that we spend so much time with these people. After all, they consider them war criminals. But they also understand that no one has the entree that we do. So we become relevant. And then from time to time, we can demonstrate to the Sudanese that even though they don't like us or trust us, on some of these issues we can be very helpful. We can be helpful and fair. And I was involved in mediating one extremely complicated border issue, and brought about a settlement that they were ecstatic about because they didn't think it could be solved. And for a while, I was the hero in Khartoum. It didn't last very long, but it was good. Well, what about South Sudan? Let me talk about what I think now are the big issues for the future. Because I think for both countries, it's important to stop blaming all their problems on the other country. Countries like to externalize their problems. Sudan does that a lot. We wouldn't have these rebellions in southern Kordofan, Blue Nile, if the South weren't supporting them. Or the Darfur Rebels wouldn't have acted up so much if they weren't getting help from South Sudan. The truth is that with the loss of oil revenue and the world changing, Sudan can't continue to be governed the way it's been governed since independence. It can't, by a combination of patronage and military repression, keep the country either peaceful or prospering. Now that's very hard for the ruling party to accept. There are people within the ruling party who know this is true, who write about it, who talk about it. But for them to admit it or to invite others into this dialogue and this issue, they haven't been able to do. In our view, that is the next major step for Sudan, for their own good and for peace and prosperity in their country. And they know it's hard, and there are people who understand it, but it's not an easy thing to do. They also have the albatross around their neck of the indictment of their president by the International Criminal Court. They probably couldn't survive politically in the present circumstances if they turned him over to The Hague. It would be too unpopular. But what do? How do you normalize with the international community when you've got a head of state who is indicted? They have tough problems, but they've got to deal with them in terms of what Sudan is. It's not, as they thought, gee, when the South goes, we're all Arab and we're all Muslims and we won't have any problems. That's not true. And they've got to deal with that. Now, what about South Sudan? I think what